It's very difficult for me to explain to people what it's been feeling, what it felt like for me to be an innocent, but having these vile accusations thrown at me. And it's just been the most horrible 22 months and 2 days.
For 60 years, Cliff Richard was the one British pop star who seemed genuinely untouchable. No scandals, no marriages, no wreckage. While every other rock and roll contemporary was burning through relationships, court cases, and tabloid front pages, he just kept performing, kept smiling, and kept his private life sealed so completely that even the people who had covered him for decades admitted they didn't really know him. But underneath that perfectly maintained surface, there were things he was carrying that the public knew nothing about. A health battle kept secret through an entire world tour, a living arrangement that raised questions for 30 years, and a period so dark he questioned everything he believed. Here is what was actually happening. The arrangement that confused everyone for 3 decades. The detail about Cliff Richard's private life that generated the most sustained public curiosity was not a romance or a scandal. It was something considerably more ordinary and, in some ways, more interesting. For the better part of 3 decades, he shared his home with his manager Bill Latham and Bill's mother Mamie, an arrangement that was domestic and stable and entirely unexplained to the outside world. To understand why this matters, you need to understand the context in which it existed. Cliff Richard was, for most of that period, one of the most famous people in Britain. His face appeared on television, on magazine covers, and on concert posters with a regularity that meant virtually every person in the country had an opinion about him. And the opinion that the majority of people who paid attention to his private life eventually arrived at, given that he had never married, never been publicly linked to anyone for an extended period, and was living with another man and that man's mother, was that he must be gay and concealing it. He addressed this directly and repeatedly over the years, with a consistency and a lack of apparent anxiety that was itself interesting. He said the assumptions were painful and unfair. He said that choosing not to sleep around did not constitute evidence about his private life. He said that marriage was a sacred commitment he was not prepared to make for the wrong reasons, and that using a marriage as a public relations exercise to quiet speculation was not something he would consider. Bill Latham, who had been a teacher before becoming involved in Cliff's management, was a central figure in his life for reasons that had everything to do with shared values and mutual respect, and nothing to do with what the tabloids wanted it to be about. They were both committed Christians. They both had a serious approach to faith that shaped how they lived. They had built a household together that was, by the accounts of people who were part of it, genuinely functional and genuinely happy, which is more than could be said for many of the conventional marriages that Cliff's critics were holding up as the standard he should be aspiring to. What the 30 years of that arrangement actually documented was Cliff Richard's determination to live according to his own values, regardless of what the public thought of the optics. That determination had costs. He knew the rumors. He understood what people were saying. He made the decision, consciously and repeatedly, that he was not going to restructure his life to manage other people's assumptions. That is a harder position to maintain for 30 years than it sounds, particularly when you are operating under the level of scrutiny that comes with being Britain's most enduring pop star. When the arrangement eventually changed, as circumstances inevitably do, Cliff simply moved on to the next chapter of his life, with the same lack of public explanation that had characterized the previous one. He did not offer a retrospective account of what those years had meant. He did not seek understanding or validation. He simply continued. The arrangement with Latham and his mother is the clearest example of what the double life the topic references actually was. Not deception in the dramatic sense, but the maintenance of a genuine private world that operated according to entirely different rules from the public one, and that the public never had full access to, regardless of how hard they tried to see it. The romances he chose his career over. The question of why Cliff Richard never married has a more specific answer than the general explanation of career devotion that he has offered in various forms over the years. There were particular women, particular moments, and particular decisions. And when you look at them in sequence, a pattern emerges that is more revealing than any single relationship. The earliest significant relationship was with a dancer named Delia Wicks, whom he met in 1960 at the London Palladium when his career was in its first explosive phase. He was genuinely attached to her. He has described her with warmth across multiple decades of retrospective interviews, and he ended it communicating the decision in a letter rather than in person, because he concluded that the demands of his rising career made a committed relationship impossible to sustain properly. The letter detail is worth sitting with. This was a man at the beginning of one of the most successful careers in British music history, writing to a woman he cared about to explain that he was choosing the career. He was 20 years old. The decisiveness of that choice at that age and the directness with which he made it says something about how seriously he took his sense of professional purpose even then. The relationship that has generated the most subsequent conversation is the one with tennis champion Sue Barker, which developed in the 1980s and had qualities that both of them have described very differently. Cliff has spoken about it over the years in terms that position it as a serious romance in which marriage was a genuine consideration that he ultimately stepped back from because he felt his feelings were not quite strong enough to justify a lifetime commitment. Sue Barker has described the same period in terms that suggest it was considerably less serious on her side than his retrospective account implies, and has expressed frustration about the frequency with which he continued to reference it in interviews long after she had moved on. The disconnect between their accounts is itself interesting. Cliff's version positions him as someone who came close to marriage, but could not quite close the distance. Sue's version suggests she did not experience the relationship as having reached that level of seriousness. The gap between those two accounts raises a question about how Cliff processed his own romantic history, whether he was inclined to invest more significance in relationships retrospectively than the other person experienced in the moment. Earlier than Sue Barker, there was Jackie Irving, a dancer he spent time with in the 1960s, and came considerably closer to proposing to than he has with most women he has mentioned publicly. He has described going to his manager and asking directly whether marriage would damage his career. He was told he might lose a significant portion of his audience. He ended the relationship. He has been candid about this in ways that have surprised people who heard the account. He described the calculation he made, the explicit weighing of a relationship against professional consequences, without apparent regret, but also without apparent comfort. It is the kind of decision that looks different depending on which direction you approach it from. Practical and self-aware from one angle, and from another angle the decision of someone who had already determined what mattered most before he fell in love with anyone. He has said more than once that his career was, in effect, the marriage he chose. The consistency with which he has returned to that framing across 60 years of interviews suggests he believes it and that it has served him. Whether it cost him something he has not fully accounted for publicly is a different question. How his faith shaped and sometimes shook everything. Cliff Richard's Christian faith is the element of his biography that gets mentioned most often and understood least thoroughly, partly because it became so associated with his public image that people stopped taking it seriously as a private reality. It was treated as a personality trait or a marketing characteristic, rather than as what it actually was, the organizing principle of his entire life, the framework through which he made decisions about relationships, money, career, and how to respond to the worst things that happened to him. He came to faith in the early 1960s, at a point when his career was already established enough that conversion carried genuine professional risk. The concern at the time, which was shared by people around him, was that a rock and roll star publicly identifying as a committed Christian would be seen as soft or strange by the audience that had made him famous. He made the decision anyway, including a very public declaration at a Billy Graham event in 1966 that left no room for ambiguity about where he stood. What faith gave him, practically, was a structure for his personal life that operated independently of public opinion. He did not drink. He did not engage in the casual relationships that were standard in the music industry of his era. He gave 10% of his earnings to charitable causes consistently across more than 4 decades, a practice known as tithing that he maintained quietly and without seeking public credit for it. He traveled to Uganda and Brazil to see the charitable work his money supported rather than simply signing checks, which is a different kind of commitment entirely. The faith was tested in ways that were not public until he chose to make them so. The murder of Jill Dando in 1999, a television presenter he knew and respected, hit him with a force that produced something he has described as genuine anger toward God. He did not lose his faith, but he went through a period of darkness in which the faith was not a comfort, but a source of active conflict, because he could not reconcile what he believed about the nature of the world with the specific cruelty of what had happened to someone he considered genuinely good. He has spoken about that period with an honesty that is different from the more managed accounts he gives about other parts of his life. The anger was real. The confusion was real. He sat with it for long enough that it constituted a genuine crisis rather than a passing doubt. He found his way through it and continued, which is also real, but the path through was not smooth or quick. His faith also shaped how he handled the most professionally destructive period of his life, when allegations were made against him in 2014 that he has always maintained were entirely false. His response to that period was filtered through a belief system that told him hatred was corrosive, regardless of whether it was deserved, which produced one of the more unusual decisions in his public life: deliberately choosing not to learn the name of the person he believed had tried to destroy him, because he did not want that person to become real enough to hate. The year the police raided his home on live television. In August of 2014, South Yorkshire Police conducted a search of Cliff Richard's apartment in Berkshire. The BBC filmed the search from a helicopter and broadcast the footage live. Cliff was not in the country at the time. He was in Portugal. He found out what was happening from a friend who called to ask if he was watching the news. The allegation that had triggered the search was that he had allegedly assaulted a 15-year-old boy at a Billy Graham event in Sheffield in 1985. Over the following period, 4 additional complainants came forward with allegations covering a span from the late 1950s to the 1980s. He denied all of it, consistently and completely, from the first moment he was informed of the investigation to the point, 2 years later, when the Crown Prosecution Service concluded there was insufficient evidence to charge him with anything. He was never arrested. He was never charged. The decision by the BBC to broadcast the police search live, before he had been spoken to by investigators, before any charge had been made, and before he had any opportunity to respond publicly, became the basis for a legal action he brought against the broadcaster. He won. The settlement he received was significant in financial terms, but he has said consistently that what mattered to him was not the money, but the principle. that broadcasting a search of an innocent man's home as breaking news caused damage that was irreversible in ways that a settlement could not repair. The 2 years between the beginning of the investigation and its conclusion extracted a specific physical toll. He was living in Portugal during much of this period, and he developed shingles, a condition whose relationship with stress is well established medically. The outbreak was severe enough that it affected his face and came close enough to his eyes that a doctor told him there was a genuine risk of blindness. He has connected this directly to the sustained psychological pressure of the investigation, describing the period as one in which the stress was not abstract but physical, something that manifested in his body in ways he could not manage through willpower or faith. He has also spoken about the specific intellectual decision he made about hatred during this period. He was aware that genuine rage toward the person who had made the allegations was available to him, and that the rage was in some sense justified. He concluded that accessing it fully would damage him more than it would damage the person toward whom it was directed, and made the choice to refuse it, including the specific step of not learning the name of his accuser so that the person remained abstract rather than concrete. That decision is consistent with his faith, but it is also consistent with something else, a very long habit of controlling his inner life with the same precision he applied to his public image. The man who had maintained a sealed private world for 60 years applied the same discipline to his emotional responses under the worst pressure he had ever faced. Whether that represents spiritual health or a form of suppression that served him in the short term and cost him something longer term is a question he has not fully answered. The secret he kept while performing to sold-out crowds. The detail about Cliff Richard's private life that carries the most immediate weight is the most recent one. At some point before his 2024 tour of Australia and New Zealand, a routine medical examination required by his tour insurers detected prostate cancer. He went on tour anyway. He performed the shows. He came home. And he eventually disclosed the diagnosis publicly in a conversation with former television presenter Dermot Murnaghan, who was himself dealing with a stage 4 cancer diagnosis at the time. The specific context of that disclosure is worth understanding. He was not doing a general press interview about his health. He was talking with someone who was facing something considerably more serious, and the conversation had an honesty on both sides that a standard publicity context would not have produced. He spoke about the experience of receiving a diagnosis during a pre-tour insurance check, the particular strangeness of discovering something that could kill you in a context that was purely administrative, and the decision to continue with the tour rather than cancel it while keeping the information private. He is clear about what saved him: early detection. The cancer had not spread to his bones or beyond its initial location. Treatment was possible and successful. He is currently in the clear, though he has acknowledged with characteristic directness that no one can guarantee it will not return. He has used the platform the disclosure gave him to argue for national screening programs for prostate cancer, a position that puts him at odds with health policy experts who have concerns about the consequences of mass screening, but which he holds with the particular conviction of someone who understands in a personal and immediate way what early detection means. The choice to keep the diagnosis private through the entire tour, to stand in front of sold-out audiences every night while carrying that specific knowledge, is consistent with a pattern in his life of maintaining a sharp division between what he shows the world and what he actually carries. He has done this across the full span of his public life. The faith kept private until he chose to make it public. The domestic arrangements kept private for 30 years, the romances ended quietly. The legal ordeal survived without daily press conferences, about his emotional state. The cancer was simply the most recent instance of a man who has always decided for himself when something is ready to be shared. He connected his disclosure publicly to King Charles's own cancer journey, both of them having navigated serious illness in the period around the same time, and has expressed willingness to work alongside the king on public health advocacy related to cancer screening. The alignment of the two most high-profile British men willing to discuss their cancer experiences publicly is itself a cultural moment that neither of them manufactured deliberately, which makes it more rather than less significant. He kept it private until he was ready. Then he said it plainly. That has been his approach to every secret he has ever held. Now, we want to hear from you. Cliff Richard spent 60 years maintaining a private life so sealed that even the people who covered him professionally admitted they never fully knew him. Does the fact that he chose when and how to reveal each part of it represent the ultimate form of control or the ultimate form of loneliness? And if the biggest secret he was keeping turned out to be a cancer diagnosis rather than anything the tabloids had spent decades speculating about, what does that say about how wrong public curiosity usually is about what famous people are actually carrying? Share your thoughts with us in the comments below. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to like and subscribe to our channel. For more interesting stories like this, be sure to click on the next video that pops up on your screen. You never know what you'll discover next.